Pauper as a format is unique in Magic the Gathering due to only cards that have been printed in common being legal. Throughout all of competitive Magic's history, decks have been built with decks of varying rarities, especially since rares and mythic rares are designed to be more complex and powerful than lower rarity cards. Pauper's lack of conventional high power threats has led to some cards being uniquely powerful in the format. Starting us off at number 10, we have Great Furnace, and by extension, all of the artifact lands in the format. Great Furnace in particular is the most played of the artifact lands, and thus takes the top spot on this list. It comes from the original Mirrodin cycle of artifact lands, which all enter untapped and can be tapped for 1 mana of each of their respective colors. The lands all mirrored basics, with Great Furnace tapping for red and essentially being the artifact version of Mountain. They notably are not basic lands, which means they'll still be subject to the same maximum of 4 copies as any other non-basic card. They also don't have land types, meaning they're less searchable, and artifacts are more easily removed than lands by most decks thanks to the more common nature of artifact hate in sideboards. Despite this, the fact that lands are artifacts offsets these downsides and were potent enough that they're still banned in the modern format to this day. This is because the lands synergize so well with affinity decks, which cast high mana value spells that would cost less based on the number of artifacts you control. The affinity strategy still exists in Pauper, where these lands are still legal, with cards like Mirror Enforcer proving to be potent threats given just how quickly the mana cost goes down. The format recently also has access to the Bridge cycle from Modern Horizons 2, a set of artifact dual lands that may enter tapped and thus aren't as good as aggressive decks, but in return are indestructible and thus cannot be destroyed by common Pauper sideboard tech like Smash to Smithereens. Beyond helping with the cost of affinity spells, the artifact lands such as Great Furnace also help turn on the ability of Metalcraft. Metalcraft is a keyword that gives a spell bonus effect as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. The most relevant Metalcraft card in Pauper is Galvanic Blast, an instant that deals 4 damage to any target as long as you have Metalcraft. Blast is such a prevalent burn spell in the Pauper format that it might as well be considered an honorable mention on this list. But part of why the card is so strong is thanks to it being so easy to turn on thanks to the density of artifact lands in the Pauper format. And at number 9, we have Kor Skyfisher. The Kor Soldier has 2 power, 3 toughness, and costs 1 generic and 1 white mana. It has the keyword Flying, which means it can only be blocked by creatures with Flying or Reach. It also requires you to return a permanent control to its owner's hand whenever it enters the battlefield. At face value, this might feel like a downside given that you're required to set yourself back for a creature without much going on for itself. However, this forced bounce is easily abused, especially given the sheer number of low mana value permanents with strong abilities when they enter the battlefield. One of the most played cards in the format as of now is Experiment Synthesizer, an artifact that costs a single red mana. Whenever it enters or leaves the battlefield, it exiles the top card of your library, and until the end of turn, you may play that card. When bounced with Kor Skyfisher, this not only essentially draws 2 cards with Synthesizer, it puts the card back in hand to be used again, either on this or on a following turn to continue plays. While this isn't perfect, as sometimes you hit cards you simply cannot or don't want to cast at the moment, and you will lose them to exile permanently, when built around interactions like this, it's simply far more likely to put you ahead than harm you. And beyond this, there are even more straightforward ways to gain advantage with Kor Skyfisher. Ichor Wellspring is a very similar card to Experimental Synthesizer, costing 2 generic mana and drawing a card whenever it enters or leaves the battlefield. Kor Skyfisher can also be used alongside some of White's most popular removal options, like Journey to Nowhere. A Journey to Nowhere exiles a creature until it leaves the battlefield, meaning with Skyfisher you can reset Journey to Nowhere if you used it in the early game, but then a much more threatening threat is played. Kor Skyfisher is a card that's versatile enough that's run in dedicated decks built around Synthesizer or similar cards. It also sees play in generally most White strategies. In White Weenie, it can be used to bounce Inspiring Overseer to draw another card and actually get some form of card advantage, which is often hard for mono-white decks to do. Kor Skyfisher is a card which is generically good with a wide variety of cards. Any set can potentially include a new low mana value creature or artifact that Kor Skyfisher can return to the hand. So not only is it currently strong, it maintains fairly scalable potential despite the card's age. And at number 8, we have Spellstutter Sprite. This fairy wizard costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana and has 1 power and toughness. It has flying, but more relevant to its place on this list is it also has the keyword Flash. This essentially allows you to cast Sputter Sprite at any time you could cast an instant, meaning it can be played in response to opponent casted a spell. This is in fact the card's intent, as whenever Sprite enters the battlefield, it counters target spell with a mana value equal or less than the number of fairies you control. This means that even just by itself, Sprite is a 2 mana creature that can counter a 1 mana spell. This alone is actually fairly relevant given the density of powerful 1 mana value spells such as Brainstorm that are available in the format. However, that's just the floor with Spellstutter Sprite, as the aggressive blue decks in Pauper which run the card also run other fairies alongside it. The most common fairies run are Fairy Seer, which lets you look at the top 2 cards of your deck and then put one of them on top or the bottom in any order, and Fairy Miscreant, which draws a card when it enters the battlefield as long as you control another card named Fairy Miscreant. Both of these fairies cost a single blue mana and thus can be played on turn 1 and start to pressure your opponent's life. And then on the second turn, you can counter their 2 mana value spells and completely swing the tempo of the game. While it's certainly not a game-ending interaction, The aggressive fairy engine allows for card selection as well as interaction. This is even more true when combined with the Pauper All-Star Ninja of the Deep Hours, which can return an unblocked fairy to hand to get another counter with Spellstutter Sprite, or further card advantage with the other fairies. Especially after the banning of Daze and Pauper, the format has shifted with many blue decks favoring the interaction and card advantage to come in the form of these aggressive creature engines. Of One Mind encourages these fairies and ninjas to be run together since they meet the condition of controlling a human and a non-human at the same time to make the spell draw 2 cards for a single blue mana. Given the banning of Gush alongside Daze, these aggressive blue decks wish to maintain the draw power they lost out on. While Spellstutter Sprite had always been an option in Pauper, the fairy engine grew to new prominence after Daze was removed and Spellstutter Sprite became one of the best counterspell options in the format. And at number 7, we have Kuldotha Rebirth. This sorcery spell costs a single red mana and has an additional cost of sacrificing an artifact. In exchange for doing so, the spell creates 3 goblin creature tokens with 1 power and toughness. Compared to a spell like Dragon Fodder, which has a mana value twice as high and creates 1 less goblin, it's clear to see why Kuldotha Rebirth would have a steep extra cost such as sacrificing an artifact. However, as you probably recall from the Kor Skyfisher entry, there are several artifacts which are actively beneficial to have leave the battlefield. When combined with a card like the aforementioned Experimental Synthesizer, Kuldotha Rebirth is an explosive spell that can often be chained into follow-up value or even sometimes another Kuldotha Rebirth. Kuldotha Rebirth decks are often fast and aggressive, leaning on blood token producers such as Voldared Epicure, a creature that costs 1 red mana and deals 1 damage to each opponent and produces a blood token when it enters the battlefield. These blood tokens can be sacrificed for 1 generic mana to discard and draw a card and help dig through the deck as well, giving even more focus and aggressive builds a better card selection than the more conventional aggro builds. These decks often have a burn plan as well, leaning on getting in as much damage as fast as possible or leveraging those burn spells to remove creatures when need be. Goblin Blast Runner is a recent addition to the Kuldotha Rebirth strategies as a 1 power 2 toughness goblin that costs 1 red mana, but gains 2 power and must be blocked by 2 or more creatures, or not blocked at all thanks to the Menace keyword ability, as long as you sacrifice a permanent this turn. Kuldotha Rebirth's extra cost has allowed it to form the backbone of an aggressive artifact strategy for several years now in Pauper. In fact, Kuldotha Rebirth has been so influential, it even has received a spiritual successor of Rechain in Gleeful Demolition and Phyrexia, all will be 1. This card can destroy any target artifact for 1 red mana, but will only produce its 3 tokens, this time Phyrexian Goblins with 1 power and toughness, if you control that artifact. This card is an uncommon, however, so while in many ways it's arguably a strictly better version of the previous card since it can be used as removal, it's not legal in Pauper and thus may never see as much competitive play as its common counterpart. And at number 6, we have Tolarian Terror. This serpent creature with 5 power and toughness costs 6 generic and 1 blue mana. However, it costs 1 generic mana less for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. It also has the keyword ability Ward, which means whenever an opponent targets it with a spell or ability, that spell or ability is countered unless the ward cost is paid. In the case of Tolarian Terror, it has a ward cost of 2, meaning any ability or spell that targets it costs 2 extra mana. This all might not seem too impressive if you played other constructed formats, but in a format with only common creatures, this is generally one of the more imposing creatures in the format. Given how Pauper is sometimes a mana-hungry format, it makes most interaction spells generally unfavorable when they cost 2 additional mana. Even the format's only real free removal spell is Snuff Out, which destroys any non-black creature for a cost of just 4 life with no mana as long as you control Swamp, which still costs 2 mana to remove Tolarian Terror. While this isn't terrible, it can often lead to situations where a player has to take their turn off to remove Tolarian Terror, or actively need to but are short of the mana required to do so. Tolarian Terror has slotted into the top end of blue-black control shells that run usually over 30 instants and sorceries. These decks are built to draw through cards, remove and counter as much as they can, and eventually land a large creature like Tolarian Terror. One could argue this slot could be given to Gurmag Angler, since it's a similar large creature that is made cheaper by having a lot of spells in the graveyard. But not only have we talked about Gurmag Angler a good bit on this channel already recently, it also is generally a more restrictive card than Tolarian Terror. Gurmag Angler exiles cards from the graveyard to cast it for cheaper, whereas Tolarian Terror simply is cost down by having a large number of cards in the graveyard. This not only means the two conflict, but Gurmag Angler actively makes it harder to cast follow-up Gurmag Anglers. That's partly why these blue-black control decks in the format run so many spells, because despite the conflict their cost down abilities provide, these creatures are both quite imposing and it's better to have both than just one. However, it's hard to argue that Terror isn't the stronger of the two, especially since its ward ability gives it inherent protection that Gurmag Angler does not have. Both creatures are quite powerful in the format regardless. The relatively high stats for low cost make them hard for decks built around smaller creatures to profitably deal with. They can help slow down games as well as close them out, and have proven to be some of the most important creatures to consider being able to beat when building a Pauper deck. And at number 5, we have Monastery Swiftspear. This human monk costs a single red mana and has 1 power and 2 toughness. The creature also has haste, allowing it to attack or be tapped while ignoring summoning sickness. It also has the keyword ability Prowess. which gives the creature +1 power and toughness until the end of turn for each non-creature spell you cast. This allowed Swiftspear to start hitting early and hitting hard, working in conjunction with burn spells, declare blockers, then attack for chunks of damage. Swiftspear was initially printed as an uncommon in the Tekir block and saw success in Standard and Modern right away. This made it somewhat surprising to some players of the Pauper format when the card was reprinted in Double Masters in 2022 as common, thus allowing it to enter the Pauper format. As previously mentioned, aggressive red decks are quite strong in Pauper, and Pauper is also full of high power and low mana value non-creature spells. As such, Monastery Swiftspear slotted into existing decks into the format fairly seamlessly. It's one of the primary attacking threats in the Kuldotha Rebirth deck mentioned previously, as well as being a mainstay in Pauper Burn. In particular, it interacts quite favorably with spells like Lava Dart, which can be flashed back by sacrificing a mountain instead of paying any mana. While this is quite the cost, if going for one big explosive turn, then every point of damage can count, and Lava Dart's direct 1 damage to any target in conjunction with triggering prowess twice can suddenly reduce 4 hit points of damage for the cost of 1 red mana. And if you're producing lethal that turn, then at that point it doesn't matter if you're down a mountain by the end of things. That's also why these decks run Fire Blast, which can deal 4 damage to any target outright with an alternative casting cost of sacrificing 2 mountains. These decks are fast and aggressive, favoring to squeeze in the damage however they can and value Swiftspear for just how quickly it starts dealing damage. The card also slotted cleanly into Kiln Fiend decks as a lesser yet still valid target for all the various free spells the deck casts like Mutagenic Growth. It also simply provides another potential large attacker alongside the Kiln Fiend and has allowed these aggressive spell-based decks to have more flexible threats. While it's a recent addition to the format, its success in other Eternal formats made it clear from the onset that Monastery Swiftspear would be a potent option, and it quickly proved those assumptions to be very right as it became the most played red creature in the format. And at number 4, we have Deadly Dispute. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 black mana, with an additional cost of sacrificing an artifact or creature. This spell draws 2 cards and creates a treasure token, which is an artifact token that can be tapped and sacrificed to add 1 mana of any color. This essentially means the spell only costs 1 mana since it refunds you via the treasure. And in fact, it can be considered an outright profit since the mana can now be filtered into any color necessary or saved for a later turn. This, coupled with essentially being a 1 mana draw 2, has led to the card being quite powerful. Not just in dedicated decks like Kuldotha Rebirth style decks, but in less all-in decks as well. The most relevant examples is the card's prevalence in Affinity decks. Affinity has adopted cards like Blood Fountain, which is 1 mana value artifact that produces a blood token, which also happens to be an artifact as well. This is a 2-for-1 deal for Affinity, but also provides fodder artifacts that can be sacrificed to Deadly Dispute. Even decks that generally are not known for having fodder creatures or artifacts to sacrifice have taken to running the card given how efficient and profitable it is to play. Some Tron decks have taken to running creatures like Mirror Retriever alongside various low-cost artifacts and playing a more combo-oriented game, using Deadly Dispute to draw through the deck and produce treasure to help filter their abundant colorless mana into other colors they might not currently have access to. The card has become a staple and nearly an auto-included any black strategy in the format. The card has seen success in Pioneer as well, particularly in sacrifice-themed decks. So perhaps it's no surprise the card has also seen a great deal of success in Pauper, where sacrifice-oriented decks are already abundant and the format is so centralized around card advantage. White-black aggro decks have adopted the card, oftentimes using it to get further advantage out of Tharbanded Spectre, whose primary value as a card comes in the form of its Enter the Battlefield effect. Deadly Dispute allows these decks to convert these small leftover creatures into further value, finding more copies of Tharbanded Spectre or other creatures like Spirited Companion. While Blue has always had access to strong card selection in Pauper, Deadly Dispute has given Black a spell on par with some of Blue's best card draw of the format. And at number 3, we have Cast Down. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 black mana and destroys target non-legendary creature. In most competitive formats, this generally won't see much, if any, consideration, given just how many powerful legendary creatures there are. However, in the Pauper format, there are very few legendary creatures actually legal, and the ones that are generally not worth playing by any standards. As such, Cast Down has the distinction of being the only 2-mana spell that can kill any creature in the format. Most decks rely on low-cost burn to deal with low-toughness creatures, or countering, or narrow removal options such as Snuff Out, which, although usually free, can only target creatures that are not black, thus making it unable to kill some very important threats such as the aforementioned Gurmag Angular. Cast Down is the lowest value mana spell that can answer effectively any card, making it the hard removal spell of choice for black in the format. The only other 2-mana spell that truly sees comparable play in the removal slot is Chainer's Edict, given that it's able to remove creatures out of protection by forcing their controller to sacrifice them. Both cards are good, however, Chainer's Edict still gives your opponent choice of what to sacrifice, and thus is fairly lackluster in certain matchups and situations. Cast Down, on the other hand, is the most flexible and widely used kill spell in the format. While it may not be as efficient as something like Snuff Out, it will usually be online and fairly cheap despite that. This is, of course, thanks to a quirk of Pauper's card pool. If there were ever new legendary creatures printed at common that were playable, suddenly Cast Down would be as situational as Doomblade in some cases. But this is very unlikely to happen, and until then, Cast Down will remain Pauper's most efficient catch-all answers to creatures. And at number 2, we have Counterspell. This instant dates all the way back to Magic's first set, Alpha. It costs 2 blue mana and could simply counter any spell. As simple as the spell is, it remains to this day the standard by which all counter magic is judged. In fact, Counterspell is a namesake for the whole group of cards called Counterspells. And while it's perhaps not the most powerful one ever printed, it still remains extremely powerful. It being printed into Modern was considered surprising to many players of the format. It has been legal in Pauper as long as Pauper has existed. The Modern rate for Counterspell is generally that spells with a mana value of 3 or higher can counter any spell, while spells of lower mana value had some form of restriction or drawback. This is because many saw Counterspell as a head-on rate, able to trade up in mana very easily and allowing a control player to advance their game while still being able to answer any sort of spell with just 2 mana. It has provided a backbone to the interaction suit for blue decks in the Pauper format. Since blue lacks hard removal, its interaction Pauper in particular tends to live and die by its counter magic. While many decks splash red or black for removal options, mono blue aggro remains a potent deck despite the variety of threats that could often stonewall other decks. Control in Pauper has always been strong, even after the banning of Daze, to a point where Counterspell affects games it doesn't even get directly involved in. Even if you don't have a copy of Counterspell, by holding up that mana, most opponents will be given some pause or even outright take a more conservative play pattern in an attempt to play around your Counterspell. While this is by no means guaranteed and can apply to any well-known piece of interaction, the ubiquitous dread that held up mana can inflict does stem back from cards such as Counterspells from those earlier sets. And despite being printed in the first set of the game, Counterspell remains one of the most played cards in Pauper, as well as being widely played in other formats where it is legal, of course. And finally, at number 1, we have Lightning Bolt. We've mentioned the boon cycle multiple times in previous videos, and this instant that costs a single red mana is a member of that cycle. These were designed to be powerful signpost spells for their colors in the first set of Magic, providing 3 of something for 1 mana. In this case, Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to any target for just 1 mana. By modern standards, this is the amount of damage you're only supposed to get for 1 mana with some form of drawback or alternative condition. Lightning Bolt, however, can be used on anything at basically any time, and as such is, at the time of recording, the most played card in Pauper. Its primary use is as a removal spell, seeing as how Pauper is a format where most large creatures aren't very good, and the best creatures tend to be on the smaller side. Monastery Swiftspear, Kor Skyfisher, Spellstutter Sprite, all of these and even more valuable creatures in the format, such as mana creatures like the Nora Elves, cannot survive a lightning bolt without outside protection. While it cannot kill everything, obviously, as many top-end creatures in the format have 4 or more toughness, for a large majority of Pauper's most relevant creatures, Lightning Bolt is effectively a murder. Beyond this, Lightning Bolt works on players as well, meaning that for dedicated burn decks, Lightning Bolt is essentially a modal spell that can hit the opponent to further the burn plan or be used as removal. Even decks not focusing on burn can sometimes leverage Lightning Bolt for a surprise win, tricking the opponent into taking damage thinking they'll survive another turn, only to then cast Lightning Bolt to finish them off. While Galvanic Blast can do more damage to a creature, it needs a condition to deal that much damage in the first place. Any other spell with a mana value as low as Lightning Bolt either deals less damage or has a condition or drawback that makes it more narrow. Lightning Bolt is the gold example of burn spells and is one that Wizards has actively said they hesitate to reprint into the standard format and has only done so once in all of Magic's history. It sees just as much play in Legacy as it does in Pauper for all of the same reasons, and is generally one of the best red cards ever printed. While some could argue other powerful spells in Pauper might deserve the number 1 spot, the sheer amount of decks that play Lightning Bolt and how iconic and ubiquitous it is in the format makes it hard for us to ignore. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.